there's still people coming in, but I'll start. Hello, everyone. I'm Anthony Brown, Chair of the APPG on the Environment. Welcome to our latest event on 30 by 30. This is the government's commitment made last year to protect 30% of the UK's land and sea areas by 2030. And which is a very welcome commitment. I think everyone supports it. The question really is, what does that actually mean? Obviously, that's 30% of protected land as national parks, SSSIs, AONBs, but will it make any difference? Will it actually help improve nature? And I know there's concern amongst certainly some environment groups that actually it could be just a paper policy, as it were, and not make a real change to nature. So we've got a panel of experts today to discuss this issue. We do have on Wednesday next week, we've got at 6 o'clock, we've got George Eustace, the Secretary of State for DEFRA, who'll be talking about the latest announcements on the improving nature that they made this week, which I think have also been very, very welcome. And you can put questions to him about that. But the people we have today are, first of all, Tony Juniper, formerly head of Friends of the Earth, but now chair of Natural England. It's got all establishment. Sorry for teasing about that. We then have Anita, Konrad, who's Chief Executive of the Campaign for National Parks, and then Joe Smith, who's the CEO of the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, but also the national lead for the Wildlife Trust on national parks and the Glover Review. I'm going to hand it over to them. They're going to do sort of short presentations about what they want to see from the 30 by 30 initiative, what they think is needed to make it real and make a real difference to the nature in the UK. And then, as always, we open it up to questions. Normal house rules apply, so please keep yourself on mute if you're not speaking, particularly if you've got a dog in the background. And with that, I'm going to hand over, first of all, to Tony Juniper.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much, Anthony. Your introduction just reminded me of being at a climate conference years ago, where one of the delegations flashed up a big cartoon onto the screen in the auditorium, and it showed somebody crawling across a desert with lots of dead trees and animals behind them. And then he reaches a spot in the desert where there's a panel of experts, and it says underneath, "Thank goodness I found a panel of experts." But hopefully we won't be as irrelevant to the cause that we're discussing today as that cartoon implied, and can give some sense of actual practical direction on all of this. And one of the things that immediately flows into the conversation when you talk about 30% protected for nature by 2030 is the fact that we already have 26% of the land designated for different environmental purposes in England. But the question then comes, what is it protected for? And is it actually doing that job effectively? Never mind the 4% which is missing. And when one looks at this question of what 30% might mean, actually there's a really important piece right at the start of that, because the word nature is often used interchangeably with biodiversity. And actually I just checked the gov.uk announcement of this from last September, and it talks about biodiversity in the headline, but goes on to talk about nature in the body of the announcement. And actually, I think what we need to be talking about is nature. And at Natural England, we have been delving into this lately to try and understand more about what we mean. Because sometimes we find, especially when we're dealing with our colleagues in the AONBs and the national parks, we sometimes seem to be speaking at cross purposes. And to that extent, we were provoked into a conversation which led us to conclude that actually we mean three things when we talk about nature. So the first thing is, yes, biodiversity. We want to have the full complement of native animals and plants and the system that they're working within. That's one heading. We want to have beautiful places, settings that inspire the human spirit, where you can see those birds, animals and plants and the wonderful ecosystems that they're in a way which actually touches something less tangible than a species list. And then the third thing we want to achieve in the same place is healthy ecosystems. So ecosystems which are catching carbon, enabling the rivers to run purely, and reducing flood risk. And so those three layers go together, and there's an additional wrapper around those three, which is the cultural and historical dimension. And so at Natural England, we're talking about 30% of the country doing as much of that in the same place as it can. beautiful places, rich in wildlife, that are full of the complement of ecosystem services that society needs. So we have 26% of the country already protected for one of those things. And the two designations we have really are for beauty, so AONBs and national parks, and then also separately for biodiversity, the SSSIs, and then layered upon that, the national nature reserves, the SACs, the SPAs, and the Ramsar sites. And you add all those up and you find that you get to quite a big number, but actually it's quite patchy. And across the AONBs and the national parks, which are by far the biggest chunk of that 26%, you find that within that big subset, only about 44%, so under a half, is wildlife rich, and the rest of it is either agriculture, urban areas, or infrastructure. So we've got a big job to do there. And even when you look at the SSSIs, we find that a lot of them are not in favourable condition, thereby cutting the level again as to what we've actually got right now, never mind the piece that we need to restore and to rebuild. This leads us to conclude that we've got three big headings that we now need to focus on. So one is the recovery of the condition of the SSSIs to get them into a good state so that they're contributing fully to this picture. The second is to expand the good quality natural habitats within the national parks and the AONBs to make them wilder at the same time as more beautiful, at the same time as catching more carbon. And the third heading is that we need to create new habitat. And obviously that's a government policy already, as reflected in the 25-year environment plan, where we aim to get 500,000 hectares of additional new habitat outside the existing protected area network during the course of that plan. Now at Natural England, the wrapper that we put around all of that, those three headings of recovering quality, expanding the natural habitat in designated areas and creating new habitat, is this idea of the nature recovery network. And this is what we've put at the center of our planning and our strategy, is to bring up quality to a higher level and expand at the same time, and to be particularly focused on those existing designated areas in the AONBs and the national parks. And, you know, we've got an increasingly strong toolkit to do this. So we've got the new policy for land coming from the ELM process, so the Sustainable Farming Initiative, the Local Nature Recovery Scheme, and the Landscape Recovery Scheme. That's a very rich set of opportunities that are there. In the Environment Bill, we will have the additional tool of biodiversity net gain, which will help put resources into this job. And then this week, we've had the announcement of the new peatland and tree strategies, again, particularly big potential there, including, you know, the fact that the national parks have a lot of peat in them, and we've got a target now to restore 35,000 hectares over the coming years. We will be operating a £50 million grant scheme out to 2025 to help with that process. And then we've got a lot of resources coming behind the tree policy too. All of that now going to be set against a target for nature that will also be in the Environment Bill, a headline target for 2030. So there is now an awful lot to work with. We're very excited at Natural England about this, and we now really need to get stuck in to delivery. And that delivery is going to be all about partnership, I think. You know, you look at the complexity on the ground in a national park, in an AONB, even, you know, a national nature reserve, often multiple actors involved who need to be on the same page to make this transition occur, that recovery of the natural world. And, you know, I think that's where we see a big role for Natural England, is convening those partnerships, including through the additional new tool that we will have coming in the Environment Bill in the form of these local nature recovery strategies, potentially a very powerful way of bringing everyone together to use all of those different policies to do that big job of 30% by 2030. I'll stop there, Anthony.
Well, thank you for that overview, and you're absolutely right. I think we all agree it's about delivery and implementation. So we're now going to come to Anita, Konrad, the Chief Executive of the Campaign for National Parks, about what they would like to see to deliver 30 by 30.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you, Tony. I feel a bit like saying what Tony just said and leave it at that, but of course I've got a few things to add. I'm really pleased to be here because this is definitely a good week to start talking about the national parks and their contributions to 30 by 30, and actually beyond that to tackling the nature and climate emergencies. Tony has already touched on a few of those points around 30 by 30. We do need to consider the quality of the existing land that is currently described as protected. One point that Tony hasn't mentioned, and I'll add, is that the creation of new protected land, the announcement also talked about the creation of a new national park, cannot divert resources from existing locations, because we're struggling already to pay for all the work that needs doing. So having said that, I'll do what every speaker does, and I'll just go slightly off brief, not too much, because I think we need to look at what national parks need in order to make a meaningful contribution. And I think there are some basic principles. I've identified 3, and I'll start with the one that won't come as a surprise, and that's resources. We know that national parks have seen a massive rise in visitor numbers during the pandemic, and it's clear that they are such a fantastic resource for all of us. But whereas the Welsh national parks have had their contribution recognised because they've received a 10% uplift in their budgets in response to this, the English national parks are seeing a repeat of previous years with a flat cash rollover of their baseline grants. And that now means that we're talking about a reduction of their core funding in real terms, which amounts to 40% over the past decade. So this is 40% reduction at a time when we're talking about the importance of protected landscapes. If we then add to this the fact that the parks have long been encouraged to compensate for government cuts by ramping up their commercial activities, which have almost completely stopped during the pandemic, I think it's quite clear that the picture is quite bleak. We've already seen a wave of redundancies across the parks at a time where there has arguably rarely been a greater need for preserving those landscapes. And I wanted to just share a quote from the chair of the Yorkshire Dales Authority's chair of the Finance and Resources Committee, who told his members, in order to maintain a steady ship for 12 months, we've effectively allocated the whole of the general reserve to maintaining services in the next 12 months. Members must be really very clear that this is a budget that cannot be repeated. And I think this is a bit of a reality check that we need in all the excitement about announcements. So do we think it is just about money? I'd say to a large extent, but not exclusively. It's really clear that we cannot simply invest more in preserving the status quo. We want the national parks authorities to be innovative, entrepreneurial. We want them to be agile, and it's very clear that there is room for improvement. But at the same time, we cannot expect them to transform when their main mode is crisis management. The second point I wanted to focus on are the powers that the national parks need to be fit for the future. So given the significance of the landscapes they are looking after on behalf of the nation, of all of us, the park authorities' current powers are surprisingly limited. Under the current model, they are having to rely very heavily on their convening skills because they do not own most, if any, of the land that they are to protect. For example, in the Dales, 95% of the land is in private or NGO ownership, and the New Forest National Park doesn't own or directly manage any land. The park's powers haven't been updated since the 1995 Environment Act, which revised their statutory purposes, and it also placed a duty on public bodies to have regard to national park purposes. This is, and I'm sure some or all of you will be aware, this is the weakest form of duty that can be imposed. So we believe that the national parks need to be able to play a leading role in tackling the current emergencies. And as parts of that, their statutory purposes need to be updated to reflect the full range of challenges that need to be addressed. The duty of regard needs to be strengthened to a duty to further the national park's purposes. And lastly, the park's management plans need to be given statutory status and should contain very clear targets for climate change and nature recovery. And I think at the moment, given that we're talking about the proposed planning reforms, there is a perfect opportunity to implement these changes, even though none of this is yet included in current proposals. The third point I wanted to make is that national parks need to be formally recognised as key contributors to delivering the government's environment agenda.
Yeah.
We're listening to scientists when they're talking about a convergence of a series of tipping points. This needs a systemic response. I believe that national parks hold quite a few of the answers to this already. They are not nature reserves that are closed shops. Instead, they're living landscapes which can and should be the showcases for demonstrating how the highest levels of nature protection can be combined with accommodating infrastructures and services that meet the everyday needs of their resident communities and of their visitors. But in order to do that, they need very clear priorities and indicators for nature recovery and for wider action on climate change. And these priorities should also be used to target additional resources, investment and funding to deliver environmental outcomes. But I think we also need to be quite clear that these outcomes cannot be achieved in full if national parks are forced to participate in competitive bidding processes for government grants. And the agenda also mentioned today mentioned the Glover Review, and a lot of you will have immediately spotted that quite a few of those proposed changes were included in the Landscapes Review. The review shone a light on the status quo in our protected landscapes, and it made a number of recommendations, enabling them to innovate and to provide solutions to the current challenges we face. Campaign for National Parks agrees with many of the review's findings, and we were heavily involved in shaping it. But I think the one thing I would really stress is that Glover is not a blueprint for implementation. I think Glover was really a fantastic invitation to start a meaningful conversation about how the protected landscapes of the future would need to be managed. Unfortunately, that conversation never happened, and 18 months on, we're still waiting for the government's response. And I think the absence of that response, which has now been imminent for several months, has created a vacuum. And I think that is very dangerous at a time when decisive and comprehensive action is needed, and when we really need to start making structural changes. That vacuum really cannot be filled with a myriad of new, often short-lived schemes. We do need both, investing in existing delivery infrastructure and investing in innovation, trying out new things, resourcing those. So to sum up, we believe that the answer to this session's questions, how can national parks contribute to achieving the 30 by 30 ambition, need to start with three priorities I've just outlined. They need the right kind and level of resources, they need updated, stronger powers, and they need formal recognition that they are one of the keys to tackling the climate and nature emergencies. Thank you.
Okay, Anita, thank you very much. That's a powerful plea for more powers and resources for the national parks. I'm married to a Canadian and spent a fair bit of time in Canada. My wife was absolutely shocked about the national parks in the UK, because in Canada they are genuinely wildernesses, and you can't build houses in them, and very few people actually live in them. Whereas here, obviously, it's totally different. We're a far more densely populated country, but the national parks are not protected to the same degree. So we now come to our last speaker, Joe Smith, of the Chief Executive of the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, who, as I mentioned, was the Wildlife Trust's national lead on national parks and the Glover Review. And then we'll throw it open to questions. Do flag up in the chat or use the yellow hand if you do want to ask a question. And over to you, Joe.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anthony, and thanks for inviting me. And I'm really pleased to be here and share a little bit of the Wildlife Trust thoughts around this idea of 30-30 and national parks. I am actually going to mix it up a bit just by sharing some slides and some photos, so just bear with me while I load that up. So as Anthony said, I'm Jo Smith. I'm the Chief Executive of Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, and I lead nationally on national parks issues. And we've been working really closely with the RSPB and the National Trust ever since the review of protected landscapes was announced. And we're really pleased to see that the UK has ambitions to be a global leader and to reframe its relationship with the rest of the world post-Brexit. And in the run-up to the Nature and Climate COPs, we've got an amazing opportunity to step up and do just that. We're also encouraged, Tony mentioned, there's been some recent announcements by the Secretary of State. We find those encouraging. And there's many examples of exciting landscape scale projects right across the country. And we saw that a bit at Delamere Forest with the speech from the Secretary of State earlier this week. In Derbyshire, we're really excited to be delivering landscape scale initiatives through the Green Recovery Challenge Fund and other funding. And that includes substantial increases in woodland cover, lots of new wetland habitat, the creation of new jobs to support landowners to better manage their land. We're part of the DEFRA Green Social Prescribing pilots, and we're reintroducing beavers later this year. But sadly, despite all this hard work by many organisations right across the country, the nature we rely on for clean air, for clean water, for crop pollination, for well-being, for local economies and so much more is rapidly disappearing. And the sad news is that's happening just as fast in our national parks, our so-called protected areas. The Protected Planet report, which was released yesterday, and I know Kate has put a link to it in the chat, highlights that our most protected areas are not effective and they're not able to fulfill their potential, and that there's a need to improve the effectiveness of those protected areas through better assessments of governance and outcomes. There is, though, wide and growing support for the 3030 vision and renewed action to reverse the decline of biodiversity. And the Wildlife Trust and the other NGOs are hugely supportive of this vision. But we're in the middle of a biodiversity crisis and a climate crisis. We don't have time to wait. We need more urgent action. And we believe national parks have a crucial part to play in being the engine room of that action, stimulating and demonstrating collaborative progress and momentum. They have been described as our crown jewels, places that showcase the very best in nature protection and demonstrate how wildlife can recover and thrive. They should be that, but they're not. But by improving them and by building from those places that we know thousands of people already know and love, we've got a huge opportunity to create wildlife-rich landscapes that are valued and protected, not just now, but for many, many generations to come. The Glover Reviews been mentioned by Anita and by Tony, and it highlighted that our national parks are currently falling way short on delivering for nature, delivering for climate, and delivering for people. Our national parks were created 70 years ago. It's their 70th birthday this year. And they were created as a healing escape for people after the war. And as we emerge from the COVID crisis, we've never had a better time to recreate that. We've got that need again. People need that escape. People need those beautiful wildlife-rich landscapes to recover from the stress of a COVID period. And on the right, I've just got the government's own press release. And the quote from the government's own press release after the report was published was that it recommended the biggest shake-up of our national parks since they were created. But like Anita says, we've heard a lot about the recommendations. We haven't heard much about how we're going to implement them. It's also really important to remember that whilst we do have lots of protected places in the UK, they are no better than the rest of the UK for wildlife. And there's some stats here on this slide. So a much lower percentage of the habitat in our SSSIs are in favourable condition. So 26% are in favourable condition in our national parks, 39% outside of our national parks. And that's the same for our precious bogs, our carbon sinks, where only 9% of our upland bogs are in favourable condition. And that's less than the national average. And devastatingly, tree cover is lower in our national parks than in some of the cities that lie close by. So examples include the Yorkshire Dales National Park and the Peak District National Park. Really low woodland cover, really much lower even than our cities. And the recent State of Nature report by the Lake District National Park highlighted significant reductions in many, many species, including lapwing, curlew, redshank, and skylark. We wrote recently to the Secretary of State, alongside the RSPB, the National Trust and the Woodland Trust, re-highlighting the need for substantial change in our national parks for them to fully realise their potential to contribute towards the 3030 vision. There are, of course, some good examples of best practice. The Moors for the Future partnership in the Peak District is amazing and has restored loads of moorland habitat. And it's encouraging to see some of the national parks starting to become a bit more ambitious. So this is a report recently published by the Exmoor National Park, and they had some illustrative designs made. So this is Exmoor National Park as it is now. And then this is their vision of how Exmoor National Park should be. But to initiate genuine change like this, which is substantial and is essential, there are a number of changes that are required. So for us, across the Wildlife Trust, across the RSPB, across the National Trust, across the Woodland Trust, we need to see a transparent baseline. We need to know what the state of nature in our national parks actually is. And then we need to set targets for improvement with clear timescales and accountability attached to them. We need to review our governance model. The governance model in our national parks doesn't work. There's too many people. We need to reform it so that our protected landscapes are led by smaller groups of more diverse people. If you go back to the original, this is what Exmoor National Park looks like at the moment, most of our national landscapes are farmed. Our protected landscapes are mostly farmland. So to support this transition, we really need to think more carefully about how we support landowners to transition to the new environmental land management schemes. It's essential to support them in that process. And we need to ensure our national parks have the skills, the knowledge and the resources to work collaboratively, to lead ambitious large-scale projects and to test, trial and demonstrate new ways of working, including rewilding and including reintroductions. And we need to improve the access and the inclusivity. Even in Exmoor's new vision, there aren't really many people in that vision, and people are essential to us achieving the 3030 vision. So we need to improve access and inclusivity so that a more diverse audience can benefit from and connect with nature. But perhaps most importantly, we need to tackle the main driving forces of wildlife declines in and out of our national parks. And that includes the burning of peatlands, intensive agriculture, extensive use of pesticides, the illegal killing of protected wildlife, and the huge lack of native woodland cover. The next few years are crucial. We have to act fast. And if we do, we have the chance to be a true global leader in nature's recovery, to address the climate challenge through natural solutions, and to create a more positive and wilder future for us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jo, for that passionate plea for more wilder landscape. And I personally completely endorse your point about needing to work with landowners. That's clearly absolutely critical. I speak as MP for South Cambridgeshire, where it's very heavily farmed. You've got to work with them, not against them. Can I just come to Tony first? I just wonder if your sort of response to some of the points made, in particular the plea about national parks needing far greater powers. But any other sort of general thoughts about the points made by Anita and Jo?
Yes, so I was struck by quite a few things that were said by both Anita and Jo, including the point about the need to be investing in the meeting of this target. It's not going to happen on its own. Government will need to put resources in to achieving the outcomes that are now set out in policy, and which actually will now be in a legally binding target too. And, you know, I think the discourse on this might need to alter a little bit. And I've been doing this kind of environmental work for long enough to know that one of the big problems we've had over the years is that looking after nature has often been seen as a barrier to achieving social progress, a block to economic growth, and therefore, you know, something of a cost that, you know, is unaffordable. I think we need to get into a position where the discourse becomes one much more about investing to get a return. And so if we do invest in the restoration of nature at the kind of scale that's now being talked about, we will get a big hit of positive benefits for the country. One of them that's been talked about a lot this week is carbon capture and also climate change adaptation. Another one is water security and the extent to which natural systems replenish the freshwater environment, obviously key to society's well-being. Another one that has been very much evident during the lockdown periods has been the public benefits in terms of health and well-being, physical health and psychological well-being, which in turn has a very positive read across into the health system and the extent to which we can avoid some of the costs that are falling as a result of chronic diseases increasing. And so if we can look at this as an investment, then perhaps, it becomes more likely that government will see the need to get behind this in a more determined way. But I'm enormously encouraged by what I've seen over the last couple of years and the extent to which now these pieces are beginning to line up behind some real inspiration and vision. What the detail of that looks like in terms of powers and duties and laws, when it comes to the national parks and the AONBs, hopefully we'll start to get a sense of direction when government responds to the Glover Review in terms of what it wants to do over the coming years and how it's going to do it. And I'm not seeing any drafts yet, but I'm told a statement is coming quite soon, which will set out some of that, leading to a consultation, possibly leading to a white paper subsequently. So, there's work in progress. But I think, behind all of that, where we go in terms of the overall destination, it's going to be around the level of ambition and the commitment we put behind achieving the ambition, because it's not going to occur on its own. And I've repeatedly pointed out, as have the national parks, that the agencies that are charged with doing this, they're under-resourced. At Natural England, we're seeing some positive progress on that side, but we need to go further and we need to have a long-term plan to do it.
Okay, thank you. Very, very strong points there. I'm going to come to some of the questions in the chat, and I'll ask people to ask them. And if you could say where you're from. And the first is from Guy Shrubsole. I think, Tony, I actually answered your question, but I don't know if you have any other question.
Thank you. I mean, I think it was just very encouraging to hear all the speakers talk about the need for wilder national parks, and obviously looking forward to seeing what the government's response to the Glover Review is as well. And I guess we would see there being a role for public bodies and water companies as relevant, authorities to do more to further the aims of nature recovery in national parks in future. So hoping that some of those recommendations that the Glover Review made, and perhaps some additional ones around kind of seeing wilder areas in national parks given some sort of footing with management plans in future. We're hoping that those sorts of things might be being proposed.
Which organisation are you from?
Oh, sorry, I'm from Rewilding Britain. Sorry, I should have said that. Thank you. That was more of a comment than a question. Apologies, but if that does spark...
If anybody wants to come back on any of our speakers.
Just one thing, Anthony, that I think lies behind some of this, which is quite an important point, and we don't kind of surface it very often, but there's a very strong cultural dimension to all of this, and the extent to which people see beauty in wildness compared to more orderly, tidy landscapes. And the Lake District recently was declared a UNESCO site, wasn't it? And, some people were worried about, well, does that mean that what we're now trying to preserve is the status quo? Because, the designation of that place was around the dry stone walls, the sheep grazed fells, and, that's not particularly wild, although to many people's estimation is beautiful. And the cultural dimension, I think, that lies behind some of this is the extent to which we can collectively as a nation embrace wild as beautiful compared with orderly as beautiful. And I think many of the tensions that lie behind this national park shift into being wilder landscapes, I think some of it is in there. And also the historical dimension, on Dartmoor, for example, I know that many people are concerned about archaeological sites being buried under trees and what have you. And, some of that stuff does need to be discussed, but it's less tangible. It's a more cultural values-based dimension, and moving beyond tidiness and into wilder places that we embrace and love. Road verges is a good example, actually. Where we mow to within an inch of its life every year, several times. Wildflowers never get a chance to get away, and very often it's because people think that looks nicer than the place becoming overgrown and full of wildflowers and insects, which to my mind is far more beautiful, but not necessarily a shared view. So how we get a national discussion going on those kinds of things, I think, is actually quite important.
I'm really glad to hear you say that, because I absolutely fully agree. And not only am I married to Canadian, I'm a half Norwegian, and in both those countries, the natural state is seen as wilderness. And the road verges in Norway, no one would dream of mowing them into a lawn and sort of killing all wildlife. They completely accept that actually nature should have its place there. And in fact, I've spoken to Cambridgeshire County Council as a Cambridge MP, because we've got all our road verges, and sometimes they're very wide. They're like 50 metres wide or so, are completely mown to less than an inch of all wildlife, and every year, and it's an expense. And actually you could have a lot of trees and bushes and berries and birds and insects there.
Exactly.
Anyway,
cut them once a year to stop the trees growing.
The pushback I had from the county council actually was that they'd have to put signs up explaining why the verges weren't tidy.
I rest my case.
It is a cultural change that we need. I mean, it's a peculiarly British thing, I think, that we see the landscape as so completely manicured as the sort of natural state rather than the sort of wilderness. Now, Kate Jennings, I don't know if you wanted to ask a question. You made a comment in there about the report. And if you could say where you're from again as well, just so everyone knows.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Kate Jennings. I'm from the RSPB. Yeah, so I just provided a link in the chat to the report that Joe mentioned earlier. So this was published by IUCN yesterday, Protected Planet Report, and highlighted that while globally we have just hit the 17% target for percentage of land protected, which was the target under the previous Convention on Biological Diversity decade framework, that much of that is poorly managed. So that's an issue in the UK, and it's one we share. I did actually have one question that I wanted to ask, which I think there was some real concern, lots of really welcome commitments yesterday in the Secretary of State's announcement, but some very real concern that the most effective legislation we have for protecting and driving management of our protected areas, the habitats regulations, does appear after yesterday's announcements to once again be in the firing line. And yeah, so I guess it's a comment really rather than a question, but just flagging that's a real area of concern, because that legislation's been reviewed repeatedly and found to be fit for purpose, but needing much more robust implementation. And so an approach which focuses on reviewing it once again rather than implementing all of those recommendations is, I guess, frustrating in the context of the urgent need for action that all of our speakers have highlighted.
Okay, thank you for that comment. I don't know if any of the speakers want to come back on that. We do have a question from Garrett Morgan, which is actually a very relevant question. So Gareth, I don't know if you're here. I can see.
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can certainly hear you. Yeah, I think this is a very relevant question. Jo did touch on it in her comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up this issue.
Say where you're from, if you're from an organisation.
Yeah, Gareth Morgan from the Soil Association. I wanted to pick up this issue of how we consider farming in the 30 targets. I mean, as you say, in other countries, national parks are wildernesses, but it's hard to envisage a situation where 30% of the land cover in the UK is going to be considered as wilderness. So a lot of it will be farmed. How do we decide what sort of farming is going to count towards the target? Whether it's sheep farming in the Lake District or whether it's arable farming in lowland Britain. So I mean, obviously my preference would be to be thinking about whether there are agroecological forms of farming that we could sort of certify and contribute to that target, or are we going for 30% wilderness, in which case, where are we going to get our food from?
I think that's a very good point. Well, as you say, unlikely to get to 30% wilderness in the UK. So who'd like to comment on that? Anita, do you have a view about the sort of farming that should be allowed in national parks?
Not specifically about farming. What I would say though is that apart from 30 by 30, we want 100% of land management to be as sustainable as possible. And I think that's something that we mustn't lose sight of. What that means will very much depend on the type of land we're talking about and also the location. So I'd be a bit nervous about being very prescriptive about that. But I think we do need some common standards for sustainable land management that are shared.
Tony.
Anthony, yeah, I might have a remark on this. One phrase that we now use, was being used very widely now, and I think it's the right one, is the idea of nature recovery. And you could imagine nature recovery embracing quite a spectrum of different things, from sustainable agriculture through to the establishment of new wilderness via rewilding. And, you know, so at one end of it, you've got the kind of mosaic that Joe showed us in Exmoor, where food is being produced, but the ecosystem is healthier. It's still an agricultural ecosystem, but a mosaic of hedges, healthier rivers, woodland, some semi-natural grassland blended in with the food production. And then you move from that into what you might regard as the next stage of semi-natural habitats, which are managed, you know, maybe for some food. So a hay meadow would be a good example. You know, it's a human construct in terms of the constant mowing and, you know, the way in which that diverse sward is created, then moving into, you know, more semi-natural habitats that are maybe partially managed, and then into truly wild land. And so I think if you look at it like that as a spectrum, you can see multiple uses being blended in with the aim of nature recovery. And, you know, what we wouldn't want to do is to abandon agriculture in this country only to be importing deforestation from South America. And, you know, that point's been made repeatedly, and it's correct. But then when you start thinking about agriculture, I think you have to think about the whole food system, you know, and if we did have a more sustainable approach here, we'd need to be then maybe linking that with diets and also consumer behavior. So, you know, if we had less factory farmed meat, we'd need less land to be growing grain to feed to animals in cages, and could be growing more fruit and vegetables, which would be good for public health. And if you eliminated food waste, we waste about a third of our food. That's like putting 1/3 of the land in the bin. I mean, that's bonkers. Actually, there's 30% right there, isn't there, if you think of it like that?
Yeah, no, very, very good point. So coming to Belinda Gordon from Green Alliance, in fact, got your name there. You've got a question about peat.
Well, yeah, sorry, I asked two questions. One was a sort of narrow one to Joe about whether, you know, the stats on your slides about the condition of peat, particularly in national parks, were pretty shocking, and whether you feel what was announced this week was enough to kind of address that. But then I guess the sort of broader question to all the speakers is sort of their feeling on how much of a priority nature is to the government, and, you know, whether there's things we can do from the outside. Green Alliance is a charity and think tank to kind of help get it taken seriously in government.
Joe, do you want to come back?
Yeah, so I think it's a really good point, Belinda. The stats are shocking, and I think, you know, we need to share those stats more regularly and make sure that people really understand the crisis that we're in. I think, you know, we welcome the announcements from the government. They're a good start. I think we'd like to go a lot further and a lot faster, is fair to say. So, you know, banning the selling of peat compost, you know, there's no reason to not do that much more quickly than is suggested. And also the peatland restoration targets are, you know, they're good, they sound good, but, you know, we'd like to see them to be much higher. So we'd like them to be sort of 10 times higher than the sort of figures they're talking about at the moment. So I think it's a start, but I do think we need to go a lot faster, a lot more quickly, and do a lot more. You know, there are carbon sinks, they hold a lot more carbon. You know, we talk about tree planting a lot, but actually restoring our peatland is a much more effective way of addressing the climate crisis and dealing with the carbon problem that we have. I think on your other point, so how do we ensure that the biodiversity crisis gets the same traction and resources and appeal from the public as the climate crisis? I mean, for me, they're one and the same, really. You know, you can't really talk about one without talking about the other, and that's perhaps something that we need, that you and others can start to help us to get that language across, really, that it's one crisis, really. The biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis are inexplicably linked, and actually solving the biodiversity crisis will naturally help substantially towards the climate crisis. So I think there's a lot of work for us all to do to highlight that and to help people to understand that. And there's a lot of work the government needs to do to address both of those things. And, you know, Tony talked about it earlier, you know, some of that is down to funding, but also some of that is down to policy decisions and different ways of working and being more open to piloting and testing and changing the way that we think about our land and the way that we manage our land. You know, going back to the farming point, you know, there's no reason why farming and wildlife can't be compatible. You know, we need to rethink the whole way. We always talk about development and wildlife being incompatible. We talk about farming and wildlife being incompatible. We need to start thinking about wildlife being the most important thing and the most important driver of decisions on all of those other ways that we use land.
I should say, just my personal point of view, and I'm not just saying this because I happen to be a Conservative MP in this Conservative government, but I have been quite pleased about how much the government has emphasised biodiversity and a whole load of different initiatives. And they could have been, you know, I think far more than previous governments that they've really tried to highlight it. But it is all about delivery. It was all about actually making it happen. I'm just wondering, Tony, on peat, do you have particular views on peat?
Well, as Joe says, it's a hugely important ecosystem. There's more carbon locked up in the peatlands of Britain than in all the trees in France, Germany, and the UK combined. I mean, just to give you a stat, and it covers a much smaller area. And on top of, you know, the carbon value, as is becoming apparent as we go along, you know, the extreme weather we're getting, which is provoking flash flooding and flooding of people's homes and businesses, you know, it's not only about the intense rainfall, it's about the degradation of the land, including the peatlands, which act like natural sponges when they're in good health. And so we get, you know, a range of ecosystem benefits from those places that go beyond the carbon. And of course, you know, go back to my layering point about layering the different values of nature. You think about the Peak District and the landscapes there that inspire people. If we restore those landscapes to be healthy, not only are we putting the beauty back into them, turning them from black to green and purple as they should be, but at the same time catching and avoiding a lot of emissions, at the same time as purifying the water, at the same time as reducing flood risk, at the same time as restoring some of our biodiversity, including many species of birds and animals and plants that are there and unique to those systems. So, you know, peatlands really does emerge at the top of the pile as one of those things that really is deserving of a priority focus. And I think the fact that we're now operating a £50 million grant scheme over the next 5 years to make a big hit on this, I think is a sign that that penny has dropped actually in government. One of the things we do need to keep an eye on, of course, is the parallel track on trees and the extent to which we don't want to be planting trees on peat. And we had a round of that in the 70s and 80s, didn't we? Especially in Scotland and the Flow Country. And so, you know, if we are going to be taking these approaches, they need to be joined up between these different priority focal points, and, you know, the trees in the right place for the right reason, and most often
sorry,
not.
and the problem, sorry for my ignorance, but the problem of planting trees on peat is what exactly?
Right, well, you dry it out.
Right.
And so very often, you know, what you do is you dig ditches to get the peat to lose a lot of its water, and that's when it starts to oxidize. And basically the carbon is kept in the peat as a result of the water separating it from the atmosphere. When you take the water away, the carbon meets the air and it turns into carbon dioxide. It unites with oxygen, and you get millions of tons of CO2 flowing out of the land and into the air. And, you know, that is essentially down to the hydrology. And, you know, if there's one simple thing you say about peat in terms of what needs to be done, you need to make it wet and keep it wet. And it's not much more complicated than that in some ways.
Lots of rain really helps. I just want to come to Emma Clark from the Wildlife and Countryside Link. You put a comment in there on the question, but I don't know whether you want to sort of make your comment verbally.
Yeah, hi, I'm Emma from Wildlife and Countryside Link. Thank you. I just wanted to highlight in the chat that Wildlife and Countryside Link thought sort of back at the end of last year about 30 by 30 and about what land should be included or count towards that target. And we sort of laid out these two conditions of protected for nature in the long term and well managed and in good or recovering condition. And it's really welcome to hear all the speakers really emphasize the importance of that well managed bit and getting, I guess, a focus on improving the existing designations and landscapes and make sure that what we have actually does contribute to nature's recovery. And as we know, that's not always the case. We highlighted some good stats around the condition of SSSIs and woodland cover in national parks. So I guess the importance here is, you know, setting out some clear criteria or conditions so that we can work towards that 30% target. And part of that is better monitoring of what we currently have and the data to inform and sort of prove the outcomes of the management, whether that management is sort of on one side of the spectrum, less interventionist rewilding, or whether that's a more agroecological.
Okay, thank you. I think your sound was going in and out there, but I think we've got the general gist of it, and I think everyone will be in agreement with that, really. Coming up to, I don't know if there's other, does anybody else have any other questions? There's lots of people posting blogs on that.
Anthony, could I just respond to Belinda's point about what do we think is needed to get nature on a par with climate change? Absolutely agree with what Joe and Tony said. It's really should be treated as one of the same. The one thing I've learned over the years is that sometimes we underestimate people and their ability to grasp the slightly larger concepts. And I think what we do need to do is to start introducing bigger scales in our conversations. We have that issue with landscape. That landscape scale is not fully understood. People see trees out on their doorstep, but they don't understand that those trees actually talk to woodlands that are nearby. They don't know about the water table. They don't know how the different functions, which we very technically describe as ecosystem services, work together. And I think there is a big job for all of us to have those conversations and say, now we've got you excited about bees and bugs and trees and growing your own veg. Let's just see how all of that fits into the bigger picture. Because I think we have to take people of all ages with us in this conversation. So it cannot just be us lobbying government to talk the talk, but it's really something that needs to be embedded. But in order for it to embed it, to get down, we need to really understand it. And I think as professionals, sometimes we're not helping it that much because we talk about nature-based solutions and all sorts of very boring concepts, which are exciting. So that's the other aspect. I think we need to learn to make those stories really exciting and engaging, because as soon as we understand, I think they will embrace all those ideas.
Yeah. So I want to come. I saw you and Cameron. Lord Cameron had his hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, well, that's more of a comment, but as well as a question. But I just continue the whole wider question of sort of land use that Tony's been touching on. I mean, England, not UK, but England is, I think, the 5th most densely populated country in the world, which list includes Singapore, I may say. And we also, as has been said already, we love our countryside. Bill Bryson said, the unique feature of the English countryside is its people love it to death. And even if we currently like it tidy, which was also another debate that we've had, the thing about our countryside is it has many outputs. It has obviously food, nation's food security, health, biodiversity, carbon sink, leisure, etc., etc. I mean, it's got an enormous number of outputs. And the big problem in the last probably 5 decades has been that we've been largely focusing on cheap, massive amount of production of food, not particularly nutritious food either, and almost the exclusion of all else, particularly biodiversity, and that's been a disgrace. So we need to slightly change that, I don't think we mustn't make the same mistake again, which is focusing on only one of the outputs. And you know, if we get a third world war or another world crisis in 2 or 3 decades, people say, what on earth were you doing running down our food supplies, offshoring it, as Tony was saying, possibly. Actually, we really need this food supply, you're focusing. So I think that in this very crowded country, we need an overall kind of land plan, which includes biodiversity, which includes agriculture, which includes all the outputs that we have. And I just think that we need to look at this not in the context of only biodiversity, but overall. And I can't quite work out how we take this forward.
Okay. Well, I couldn't agree more, Ewan. And you know, one of the big questions which I think is rarely debated is the question of what is the best use of our land and sea. What can we do with what we've got? I mean, in the end, you know, a country is only its land and sea, isn't it? And, you know, obviously its people and its culture. But we, as you say, we need food, housing, infrastructure, energy, water, biodiversity, carbon capture. All of those things have to be accommodated in what is a pretty crowded space. And so, you know, one answer to what we might do about this, and it's not the full answer, but it will take us towards it, is during the coming period when we see the planning bill and the new legislation that will revise the planning system, I think it's going to be essential that we make that one and the same thing as the local nature recovery strategies. Because if these two things go off in divergent paths again, we just recreate the problem we've got now. We've got a golden once in a generation opportunity to pull those things together so that we finish up with one spatial planning document, ideally is how I would see it, that says this is the nature recovery and this is the housing, and these things are joined up and they're one and the same plan, rather than one saying, you know, here's the local nature recovery strategy. Well, the housing is actually more important, so we're going to put them on the places that we need to recover. We don't make much progress. And so I think there's a really important debate to be had over the coming months about how we align those two things to get that maximum benefit for the country, because everyone can see that our environment is knackered and it needs to be improved. At the same time, yes, we do need some more housing and we need some more infrastructure. So what is the template that pulls those two things to get the best possible outcome for both? And I do hope over the next months we'll see that beginning to happen.
I think that's a really good point, Tony, and I'll definitely push that on government as well. So Lord Caithness has got a question as well. If you take yourself off mute, and we've only got a few minutes left, so if you keep questions and answers short, please.
Thanks, Anthony. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up what Tony said, because I absolutely agree with him. And that's what slightly worries me about the 30% of the UK being protected. There's the whole of the UK needs protected. There needs to be a continuous area of land for nature and for farming. And if we concentrate just on protecting 30%, we might very well lose sight that the rest of the country is equally as important. So you've got 10% of the land developed, you've got 30% totally protected. What about the 60% in the middle? That's got to have a plan. Otherwise, we're going to end in total chaos with a few isolated blocks of protected species and nothing in the middle.
That is a very good point. We can't give up on the rest of it. Does somebody want to come back on that? Literally last thing, Joe, I think.
Well, I was just going to say that I think that's certainly the vision of the Wildlife Trust for the Nature Recovery Network, you know, is to create a network across the whole country of connected wild spaces. And I think you're absolutely right. We cannot forget about the 70%. And I think we have to think, I mean, Anita mentioned it as well, we have to think about how everything can be done in a more wildlife friendly way across the whole of the country. But I do think it's important as well to have genuinely protected places that are actually, you know, elevated out of that space and they are for nature primarily. I think just going back to some of the stuff around, you know, land use planning, I guess, is kind of what we're talking about. Quite a lot of the councils are doing natural capital plans, which I think is quite an interesting way of thinking about that and follows the sort of desk up to review type thinking, really, where you kind of really think about what is the best use of that space. And I think that, you know, certainly Derbyshire County Council and Sheffield Council have started to think like that. And I think that's really encouraging, thinking more joined up way about how to ensure that wildlife is part of all of their plans and the best way of doing that. So I think that is encouraging, but I think we need to see a lot more of it.
Okay, Joe, well, thank you. It is 11:30, so I'm going to draw this meeting to a close. Thank you, Anita, Tony and Joe. Really interesting discussion. I think there's a sort of uniform agreement here that we've got to operationalise it. We need more powers and resources to deliver a meaningful 30 by 30. As I said at the beginning, we do have George Eustace 6 o'clock next Wednesday, and I'm sure some of these questions will be put to him. So with that, thank you all very much. Till next time.
Anthony.
Bye.
Good to see you all. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.